My name is Stacy Rodriguez, and I'm 27 years old now. I run a successful tech company, I pay my own bills, and on paper, my life looks solid, stable, even enviable. But whenever people ask me where I came from, I hesitate because the truth is, I didn't come from a loving home. I shammed from two people who never wanted me in the first place. My parents, Stephen Rodriguez and Diana Rodriguez, were the kind of people who looked impressive from the outside. They dressed well, spoke confidently, and loved reminding everyone how busy and important they were. My father was a ruthless business consultant who measured human worth in profit margins. My mother owned several luxury boutiques and treated exclusive like a personality trait. To outsiders, they were ambitious, successful, and aspirational. Inside our house, they were cold, resentful, and painfully honest about one thing: they saw me as a mistake. They never hid it, not once. I grew up hearing things no child should ever hear from their parents. My mother used to sigh dramatically whenever she looked at me and say, "Do you know how far I could have gone if I hadn't wasted my 20s being a mother?" My father was more blunt. He'd glance at me like an unwanted bill and mutter, "You set us back years. Everything would have been easier if you hadn't been born." They said those things directly to my face, not in moments of anger, not during arguments, just casually like stating facts. I learned very early that love wasn't something I could earn in that house. They were always busy. Meetings, conferences, phone calls, flights. I learned how to cook simple meals because no one else would. When I needed help with homework, my mother wouldn't even look up from her laptop. "Ask your teacher," she'd say. My father would wave me away, annoyed that I'd interrupted whatever empire-building fantasy he was indulging that day. School events. They never came. Not a single parent-teacher meeting. Not a single recital or science fair. I remember standing on stages and scanning the audience, pretending it didn't hurt when I never found them. Other kids complained when their parents embarrassed them. I used to wish mine cared enough to even show up. When they did notice me, it was only to criticize. I was a straight-A student, but they never praised me. Instead, they mocked my interests, especially computers. "You think fixing laptops is a career," my mother sneered once. My father laughed and said, "You're not built for the real world. You'll never survive without us." The irony still makes me angry. The worst part wasn't the neglect. It was the blame. Every fight they had somehow became my fault. If my mother's business stalled, it was because motherhood held her back. If my father lost a deal, it was because he'd wasted years raising a child he never wanted. I became the scapegoat for everything they resented about their own lives. As a kid, you don't understand narcissism or emotional abuse. You just internalize it. I spent years thinking I was defective, that if I were smarter, prettier, more impressive, anything, they'd love me. They never did. The truth finally came out when I was 16. My Aunt Laura Rodriguez, my father's younger sister, came to visit. She was different, warm, observant. She noticed things no one else bothered to see. One night I broke down and told her everything: the comments, the neglect, the way my parents treated me like a burden instead of a daughter. She listened quietly. Then she said something that changed everything. "Stacy," she said softly, "your parents never wanted a child. They only had you because the family pressured them. They've resented you your entire life." Hearing that hurt more than anything they'd ever said to me, but it also freed me. Their cruelty wasn't because I was unlovable, it was because they were incapable of love. From that moment on, something inside me shut down. I stopped trying to earn their approval. I stopped hoping they'd change. Instead, I started planning my escape. College became my way out until they crushed that too. When I started applying, they laughed. They refused to help financially, even though they easily could have. "You don't have a future," my father told me. "Don't expect us to waste money on a lost cause." That was the moment I knew I was truly on my own. By 17, I was saving every dollar from odd jobs. My parents didn't just allow me to leave, they encouraged it. "Don't let the door hit you on the way out," my mother said with a smirk. I moved in with Aunt Laura just before my 18th birthday. Her apartment was small and modest, but it felt safer than the mansion I grew up in. The first night I stayed there, she looked me in the eyes and said, "I can't fix everything, but you're not alone anymore." For the first time in my life, I believed someone. Living with Aunt Laura felt strange at first, like I was trespassing in someone else's life. I'd spent so long trying to take up as little space as possible that even being offered kindness made me uncomfortable. I apologized for everything: for using too much hot water, for leaving my shoes by the door, for existing too loudly. Laura noticed. One night after I apologized for the third time in 10 minutes, she gently but firmly said, "Stacy, you're allowed to be here. You don't need permission to exist." I laughed it off, but later that night, I cried quietly into my pillow because no one had ever said that to me before. The reality of college hit us almost immediately. I'd been accepted into a solid university, one that could actually open doors for me, but without my parents' financial support, it felt impossible. On paper, my family was wealthy. In reality, I had nothing. Their income disqualified me from most need-based aid, even though they hadn't given me a single dollar. It felt cruel, like the system was punishing me for having parents who technically existed but functionally didn't. Laura didn't sugarcoat it. She sat across from me at her tiny dining table, papers spread everywhere, and said, "This is going to be hard, but hard doesn't mean impossible." We attacked the problem like a full-time job. Scholarships, grants, private funds, obscure programs I'd never heard of. We applied to everything. I wrote essay after essay reliving my childhood in carefully worded paragraphs that made neglect sound like adversity and emotional abuse sound like resilience. Some nights I stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop and wondered how much of myself I had to bleed onto the page to convince strangers I was worth investing in. Laura read every draft, corrected my grammar, and reminded me over and over again that telling the truth didn't make me weak. The most frustrating part was explaining my parents' absence to scholarship committees. Why aren't they contributing? People asked confused. I never knew how to answer that without sounding bitter or dramatic. Laura once shook her head and said, "It's insane how their money counts against you when they're the last people who would ever help." She was right. It felt like being trapped between two worlds, too privileged to qualify for help, too abandoned to survive without it. After weeks of applications, rejections, and endless waiting, something finally broke in my favor. I secured a scholarship that covered nearly 80% of my tuition. I remember staring at the email, reading it over and over, afraid it would disappear if I blinked. I laughed. Then I cried. Then I laughed again. The remaining 20% still loomed over me like a shadow, but before I could even spiral, Laura said, "I'll cover it." I immediately refused. I told her I couldn't be another burden, another responsibility she didn't sign up for. She shut that down instantly. "Helping you isn't a burden," she said. "It's what family is supposed to do." That word family still felt foreign on my tongue. Living with Laura wasn't just about survival. It was about unlearning everything my parents had taught me. She called their behavior what it was: abuse. Not discipline, not tough love. Abuse. Hearing someone say that out loud was unsettling and validating at the same time. She told me it was okay to be angry, okay to grieve the parents I never had, okay to stop making excuses for people who had hurt me. Slowly, painfully, I started to believe her. I worked constantly, tutoring, waitressing, doing small freelance tech jobs whenever I could find them. I was exhausted all the time, but it felt different than the exhaustion I'd known growing up. This kind came with purpose. Every dollar I earned was proof that I could stand on my own. When college finally started, I moved into a cramped dorm room with peeling paint and a roommate who snored loud enough to rattle the walls. I didn't care. For the first time, my future felt like something I owned. College was overwhelming. I was behind socially, financially, emotionally. While other students talked about family vacations and parental allowances, I calculated how many hours I needed to work just to afford groceries. I skipped parties. I skipped sleep. I focused on my classes, determined not to waste the opportunity I'd fought so hard to get. There were nights when I questioned whether it was worth it, whether I was just proving my parents right by struggling so much. But then I remembered their voices telling me I'd never make it, and I used that anger like fuel. By the end of my first year, something shifted. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was learning, growing, building confidence I didn't know I was capable of. I realized that leaving my parents' house hadn't just saved me financially, it had saved me emotionally. I made myself a promise then, sitting alone in my dorm room late one night. No matter how successful I became, no matter how much they tried to rewrite the past, I would never let them back into my life. Cutting them off wasn't cruelty, it was self-preservation. At the time, I thought that promise would be the end of the story. I had no idea it was only the beginning. By the time my second year of college rolled around, exhaustion had become my default state. I lived in a constant cycle of classes, work shifts, and late-night studying running on caffeine and sheer stubbornness. But somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, something unexpected happened. I started to feel capable, not confident in the loud, showy way my parents pretended to be, but quietly certain that I could handle whatever came next. That feeling was new, and it scared me almost as much as it empowered me. It was during one of my computer science lectures that I met Daniel Wright. He sat 2 rows behind me, always scribbling notes faster than the professor could speak. One afternoon, when the lab software crashed, for the third time in a week, we ended up staying late to troubleshoot it together. What started as frustrated muttering turned into an easy conversation. We bonded over bad sci-fi movies, messy code, and the shared understanding that we both felt slightly out of place among students who seemed far more carefree than we were. Daniel wasn't flashy or loud. He was thoughtful, focused, and genuinely kind qualities I wasn't used to noticing right away, because they'd never existed in my parents. We started studying together, then grabbing cheap takeout after late-night coding sessions. Before I realized it, Daniel introduced me to a small group of friends who were just as driven and awkward as we were. None of them cared about where I came from or what my parents did. They cared about ideas, effort, and whether the code worked. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere without having to earn it through perfection. That sense of belonging changed everything. One night, huddled around a flickering laptop in the library, we started brainstorming a side project. Nothing serious, just a way to solve a problem we all kept running into during our part-time jobs. At first, it was a joke. Then it became a challenge. Then it turned into something that actually worked. We started tweaking it, improving it, testing it in real-world scenarios. None of us thought of it as a business. It was just ours. A quiet rebellion against the narrative that we were too young, too broke, or too inexperienced to build something meaningful. While my world was expanding, my parents remained distant, which suited me just fine. They didn't call. They didn't check in. Every once in a while, Laura would mention something she'd heard through family gossip, another charity gala, another glowing social media post about their perfect life. I knew without needing proof that they were telling people a very different version of my story. In their version, I'd left by choice. I'd been given everything. I'd been ungrateful. The idea that they were rewriting my life like that made my chest burn with anger. But Laura always reminded me, you don't owe anyone your truth until you're ready. So I focused forward. The side project slowly gained traction. A few small clients reached out, then a few more. We registered it as a real company during my senior year, half terrified, half exhilarated. Balancing schoolwork and a growing business was brutal. There were nights I slept under my desk, mornings I went to class without having eaten, moments when I seriously considered quitting everything just to breathe. But every time I wanted to give up, I remembered what my parents had said about me never surviving on my own, and I kept going out of spite, if nothing else. Graduation crept up on me faster than I expected. When I found out I'd been named valedictorian, I stared at the email in disbelief. Part of me wanted to call my parents just to see if maybe, just maybe, it would matter to them. I didn't. Instead, I called Laura. She cried. She told everyone she knew. She showed up on campus weeks before the ceremony just to help me practice my speech. Standing on that stage, looking out at the crowd, I felt something close to peace. I'd done it. Not because anyone believed in me, but because I believed in myself. Or at least I'd learned how to. Laura sat in the front row, beaming. Daniel and our friends cheered like maniacs. For a moment, the past didn't matter. Then I saw them. Stephen and Diana stood just outside the auditorium, dressed impeccably, laughing with other parents like they belonged there. My stomach dropped. They hadn't told me they were coming. They hadn't asked. They'd just shown up ready to claim a moment they had no part in earning. I walked right past them without stopping, my heart pounding. I wasn't going to let them ruin this. Not today. After the ceremony, as I stepped outside, my mother waved at me, all smiles and warmth, like we were some picture-perfect family. "Stacy, darling." "There you are," she called. I felt my chest tighten. When I asked what they were doing there, she said, "We wouldn't miss your big day. We're so proud of you." The word proud sounded foreign coming from her mouth. My father chimed in, praising my achievement like it reflected well on them. Something in me snapped. I told them the truth, that they didn't even know I was valedictorian, that they were only there for appearances, that they didn't get to rewrite history now. My mother's smile cracked. My father's face reddened. Laura stepped in before things escalated further, guiding me away with a gentle hand on my arm. That night I celebrated with the people who had actually been there for me. I laughed. I toasted to the future. I didn't think about my parents again. I thought that confrontation had closed the door. I was wrong. I thought graduation would be the last time I ever had to look my parents in the eye. I was wrong about that too. In the weeks that followed, life moved fast. I relocated to a new city with Daniel, and the rest of the team rented a cramped office space that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition, and threw myself into growing the company. We worked insane hours, argued over features, celebrated small wins with cheap beer, and slowly, almost cautiously, started to believe that this thing might actually become something real. For the first time in my life, my future wasn't theoretical, it was tangible. My parents, on the other hand, suddenly remembered I existed. It started subtly. An email here, a voicemail there, always warm, always vague. "We've been hearing wonderful things about you," my mother wrote. "We'd love to reconnect." They talked about family, about healing, about moving past misunderstandings. They never apologized. Not once. I ignored them, hoping silence would make the message clear. It didn't. One afternoon, I received a message from an old family friend congratulating me on my success and telling me how proud my parents were. Apparently, they'd been telling people they'd always supported me, that they'd sacrificed everything to help me succeed. Reading that made my hands shake. They weren't just trying to reinsert themselves into my life. They were rewriting it entirely, turning my pain into their accomplishment. I sent them one email, just one sentence. "Do not contact me again." I blocked their numbers, their emails, every avenue I could think of. For a brief moment, it felt like relief, like freedom. I thought I'd finally outgrown them. Then my phone exploded. Daniel called first, his voice tight with panic. "Have you seen what they posted?" My heart sank before he even finished the sentence. I opened my laptop, and there it was, a public social media post from my parents tagging me, my company, my business partners, even some of our early clients. The post was a masterpiece of manipulation. They claimed they'd funded my education, guided my career, and been the driving force behind my success. They painted me as an ungrateful daughter who'd cut them off after using their money. The comments poured in. Some people praised them. Others questioned me. Investors hesitated. Clients emailed concerned. The damage was immediate and terrifying. For a few minutes, I just stared at the screen frozen. This was their pattern. Control the narrative. Destroy anything that didn't serve them. But this time they'd gone too far. They weren't just hurting me. They were threatening everything I'd built. Daniel sat across from me, jaw clenched. "We need to respond," he said. But not emotionally. Strategically. He was right. I didn't want to scream online. I wanted the truth to speak for itself. And I had the truth. Years ago, back when I still lived with them, I'd started recording conversations. Not because I planned revenge, but because I needed proof. Proof that I wasn't imagining things, that the cruelty was real. I had videos of my mother mocking my college applications, my father telling me I'd never amount to anything, both of them openly admitting they regretted having me. That night I uploaded everything. I wrote a detailed post laying out my story calmly and clearly. I attached the videos. I didn't embellish. I didn't insult them. I just told the truth. Within hours, the post went viral. Comments shifted. People were horrified, angry, supportive. The narrative flipped so fast it was dizzying. The fallout from my parents was immediate. Friends distanced themselves. Colleagues went silent. My mother shut down her boutique's social media after the backlash became overwhelming. For the first time, they were facing consequences they couldn't charm their way out of. But I wasn't finished. I contacted my lawyer, Sarah Mitchell, the next morning. She watched the videos, read the posts, and leaned back in her chair. "This is defamation," she said simply, "and we're going to take them to court." Serving them the lawsuit felt surreal. Their reaction was pure chaos voicemails, swinging wildly between tearful apologies and furious threats. My father left one message warning me I was making a mistake. I didn't respond. I let Sarah handle everything. I focused on damage control. I called every client, every investor. I explained the situation and showed proof. It was exhausting, humiliating, and necessary. Slowly, trust returned. But my parents were just getting started. They called relatives they hadn't spoken to in years, painting themselves as victims. They even tried to guilt Aunt Laura into convincing me to drop the case. She shut them down without hesitation. "You owe them nothing," she told me. Hearing that felt like armor. A week later, they escalated again, this time through the media. A small local paper ran their story, portraying me as an ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned loving parents after using their money. I was furious. But Sarah just smiled grimly. "Good," she said. "They're digging their own grave." She added the article to our case file. We prepared to escalate. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I realized something unsettling. My parents didn't want reconciliation. They wanted control, and they were willing to burn everything I loved to get it. I wasn't dealing with parents anymore. I was dealing with enemies. Once the local paper ran their story, something inside me hardened. Up until that point, part of me, small and embarrassing as it was, had still hoped this was just another manipulation tactic that would burn out once it stopped working, that they'd panic retreat and quietly disappear again. But watching my parents deliberately lie to the media, watching my name twisted into a narrative of greed and betrayal, made one thing painfully clear. They weren't trying to fix anything. They were trying to punish me for escaping them. And punishment to them meant public destruction. The article spread faster than I expected. It was picked up by blogs, shared in comment sections, discussed by people who had never met me, but suddenly felt entitled to judge my character. Emails started trickling in, polite but cautious messages from potential clients asking for clarification, investors requesting a pause until things settled. Every delay felt like a crack in the foundation I'd spent years building. Daniel tried to stay calm, but I could see the tension in his shoulders the way he double-checked every email before sending it, the way he watched me like he was worried I might break. That night, we sat in the office long after everyone else had left, the city lights flickering through the windows. "They're not going to stop," he said quietly. "Not unless you take the power away from them completely." He was right. My parents thrived on ambiguity. As long as there was doubt, they could keep spinning lies. I'd already shown parts of the truth, but now I understood something crucial: half measures wouldn't work. If I was going to end this, I had to end it decisively. The next morning, I made another post. This time, I didn't just share videos. I shared receipts, screenshots of emails where my parents explicitly refused to help with tuition, text messages where my mother called me a financial drain, bank statements proving I'd paid for my education myself, scholarship letters, part-time job records. I even included a handwritten note Aunt Laura had given me during my first semester, reminding me that surviving didn't make me weak. It made me strong. I addressed the article point by point, calmly dismantling every lie it contained. I didn't insult the paper. I didn't beg for sympathy. I simply presented evidence. The internet did the rest. The backlash was swift and brutal. People flooded the newspaper's page demanding a retraction. Journalists began reaching out to me directly asking for my side of the story. Influencers shared my post calling out my parents' behavior for what it was: exploitation. Within 48 hours, the narrative had completely flipped. My parents went from wronged philanthropists to textbook examples of narcissistic abuse. My mother deleted her personal accounts first. My father followed shortly after. Even his professional profile vanished overnight, as if erasing himself could undo what they'd done. According to Laura, their social circle evaporated almost instantly. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. People they'd once considered beneath them suddenly wanted nothing to do with them. That's when the emails started. My mother's message was long, rambling, and incoherent. She apologized, then blamed me, then apologized again. She said she'd only gone to the media because she felt cornered, because she was scared of losing me forever. She begged me to take everything down, claiming the backlash was destroying their lives. My father's email was shorter and colder. He accused me of slander-threatened legal action and warned me I was playing with fire. I forwarded both messages to Sarah without replying. "Let them try," she said. "They've already lost." The court proceedings officially began 2 weeks later. Sitting in that courtroom watching my parents avoid my eyes felt surreal. For once, they weren't in control. They couldn't interrupt charm or intimidate their way out of accountability. Sarah methodically presented our evidence piece by piece until their lawyer looked visibly uncomfortable. When my mother tried to speak directly to the judge claiming she'd been misunderstood, she was shut down immediately. The judge reminded her that this wasn't a performance. By the time mediation was suggested, my parents were desperate. Their lawyer approached Sarah with an offer $500,000 in damages in exchange for dropping the suit and removing my posts. When Sarah relayed it to me, I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was insulting. $500,000 wouldn't undo the years of damage, the sleepless nights, the near collapse of my company. Sarah went back with my counteroffer, $3 million, a public apology, and a permanent no-contact agreement. No negotiations, no revisions. For days we heard nothing. Then finally they caved. Signing the settlement papers felt heavier than I expected, not because I felt guilty, but because this moment represented something final. Once I signed, there would be no more chaos, no more waiting for the next attack. They would be legally and permanently removed from my life. When the apology went live, it was everything I thought it would be: stiff, humiliating, and painfully forced. They admitted to lying, to damaging my reputation, to exploiting my success. The comments were merciless. People didn't just criticize them, they dissected them. Any illusion they'd built over decades collapsed in a matter of days. And with that, the power they'd held over me, my entire life, disappeared. For the first time, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was finally in control. The silence after the settlement was finalized felt unreal. For years, my life had been shaped by anticipation, waiting for the next insult, the next lie, the next attempt to pull me back into their orbit. Now there was nothing. No emails, no voicemails, no legal threats disguised as concern. Just quiet. The money hit my account a few days later, $3 million. Seeing that number on the screen didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me feel validated. That money wasn't a reward, it was acknowledgement. Proof that what they'd done was wrong, that the damage was real, and that I hadn't imagined any of it. I reinvested most of it straight into the company. New hires, better infrastructure, long overdue expansion plans we'd been too cautious to touch before. Watching the business grow faster than we'd ever dared to plan felt surreal, like stepping into a life I'd only ever pictured from a distance. The rest of the money went where it belonged. I paid off Aunt Laura's mortgage without telling her first. When I handed her the paperwork, she stared at it in confusion before it finally sank in. She cried harder than I'd ever seen her cry, not because of the money, but because for once, someone had taken care of her the way she'd taken care of me. I booked her a month-long trip to Italy, something she'd always talked about but never allowed herself to do. "You saved me," I told her. "This is just me saying thank you." She shook her head and said, "No, Stacy, you saved yourself. I just reminded you how." The court-mandated apology from my parents lingered online for weeks. Every time someone reshared it, it reopened the wound they'd tried so hard to hide. Their reputations never recovered. According to family gossip, which Laura filtered carefully before passing along, they'd become isolated, bitter, and paranoid, convinced everyone was judging them. Maybe they were. Maybe that was the consequence of building a life on image instead of integrity. As for me, life became peaceful. Not perfect. Peaceful. I still had moments where old memories surfaced unexpectedly. A phrase, a tone of voice, a passing resemblance. Healing wasn't linear. But for the first time, I was processing my past without actively being hurt in the present. Therapy helped. So did honest conversations with Daniel, who'd stood by me through every ugly public step of the lawsuit without once asking me to be smaller or quieter about my pain. I didn't feel the urge to forgive my parents. And that surprised me, not because forgiveness felt necessary, but because I finally understood it wasn't required. Closure didn't come from absolving them. It came from reclaiming myself. Stop. Part 7. Closure without forgiveness. People sometimes ask me if I regret taking my parents to court. They phrase it carefully, like they're worried the question itself might reopen something fragile. My answer is always the same. No, I don't regret telling the truth. I don't regret protecting my work, my reputation, or my sanity, and I definitely don't regret refusing to let people who broke me benefit from the version of myself I built without them. My life now looks nothing like the one my parents imagined for me, and that's the point. My company is thriving. The people around me care about who I am, not what I represent. I've built a family out of loyalty, respect, and choice, not obligation or shared DNA. That difference matters more than I ever understood growing up. Do I ever think about Stephen and Diana occasionally? Mostly in the abstract. I wonder if they ever regret their choices, or if they're still blaming me for everything that went wrong in their lives. But the truth is, their thoughts don't carry weight anymore. They don't get to define me. They lost that privilege a long time ago. If there's one thing this entire experience taught me, it's that success isn't just about achievement. It's about boundaries. It's about knowing when to walk away and when to stand your ground. It's about understanding that love doesn't hurt and family doesn't treat you like a liability. So this is where my story ends. Not with forgiveness, not with reconciliation, but with clarity. To anyone who grew up being told they were too much or not enough or a burden for simply existing, build your life anyway. Build it carefully. Build it honestly. And if the people who hurt you try to take credit for what you survived without them, don't be afraid to take everything back.